In the summer of 1825, deep in the tobacco fields of North Carolina, a rumor began to move through the quarters like smoke. Two brothers, Elijah and Micah, enslaved since birth, had been seen gathering tools at night, whispering beneath the magnolia trees. No one knew the full truth, only that something dangerous was coming. By the time overseers noticed the missing oil lamps, it was already too late. What started as a whisper would end in fire. 9 plantation masters burned alive, their grand houses turned to ash, their power consumed by the very hands they once chained. For nearly 2 centuries, the story was buried hidden in church records, erased from local memory. But tonight, we're bringing it back to light. The untold rebellion of Elijah and Micah. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories they tried to erase, must be told. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? The sun rose over North Carolina like a slow, relentless fire, spilling golden light across fields that seemed to stretch forever. Cotton and tobacco swayed in the morning breeze, a sea of green and white that shimmered under the oppressive heat. From a distance, the plantations looked serene, orderly, almost beautiful. But beauty, in this land, was a mask. Behind the whitewashed walls and manicured fields, a darker rhythm pulsed, one measured not in hours but in fear. Enslaved men and women moved like shadows, bending beneath the weight of the day, their bodies carrying the invisible chains of generations. Every step they took was dictated by the whip, every breath measured by the overseer's watchful eye. The brothers, barely teenagers, rose with the dawn, their muscles already aching from years of toil. Their skin glistened with sweat, their hands raw and blistered from the wooden plow and sharp-edged tools that had become extensions of their bodies. Each day was the same, yet the sameness was a kind of torture. Even the birdsong seemed to mock them, a reminder that freedom existed somewhere beyond these endless fields, somewhere they could not reach. The plantation was a world unto itself, rigid and cruel, where the masters' voices carried across the fields like thunder. Commands barked, insults hurled, punishments administered with a precision that left no room for mercy. The air smelled of earth and sweat, smoke from the kitchen fires mingling with the dust kicked up by trudging feet. The brothers moved with quiet efficiency, eyes darting to one another for reassurance, small gestures that spoke volumes. Survival depended on silence, on knowing when to obey, when to hide anger, when to speak, and when to swallow words that could get them killed. Children ran barefoot across the fields, their laughter sharp and brittle, the innocence of youth forced into stolen moments between labor. Women bent over the crops, their backs bent like the young saplings they tended, faces lined with exhaustion, eyes that had learned too early how to endure without hope. Men carried the weight of the past on their shoulders, the memory of stolen freedom, of families torn apart, of dreams buried beneath soil and sweat. The brothers paused for a moment at the edge of the field, glancing toward the manor house that towered over everything, white and pristine, a palace built from suffering. Flames of anger flickered in their hearts, but they swallowed them, knowing the price of defiance was blood. And yet, as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the land, they felt it, the faint stirrings of something dangerous and irresistible. In the stillness between commands and labor, they sensed the first spark of a fire that no whip could extinguish, a fire that would one day consume the very chains that bound them. The two brothers moved through the fields with a quiet confidence that set them apart from the others, not because they were stronger or faster, but because their minds worked in ways the overseers could not predict. Elijah, the older by 3 years, carried a careful intensity in his eyes, always watching, always calculating. He noticed the smallest detail, the way the wind shifted over the corn, the rhythm of the guard's footsteps, the patterns in the master's routines. His younger brother, Micah, carried fire in his heart, a restless energy that made him daring, unafraid to push boundaries, to challenge limits in ways that could bring both awe and danger. Together, they moved as one, a single unit forged by hardship and shared purpose, a bond that nothing could break. In the early mornings, before the overseer's whistles tore through the air, The brothers would slip into hidden corners of the fields, exchanging whispers that held dreams too dangerous to voice in full. They spoke of freedom, of running far into the forests and rivers that lined the horizon, of tasting a world where their names belonged only to them. They imagined nights under open skies, unchained, unbound, with the stars as witnesses to their laughter instead of the harsh glare of lanterns and the cold judgment of masters. In those stolen moments, their spirits soared higher than the cotton stalks that towered over them, higher than the fences that confined their bodies. The plantation around them was a constant reminder of everything they lacked. They watched other enslaved people bend under relentless labor, their faces hardened by years of submission, their eyes dimmed by hopelessness. Yet the brothers refused to let despair take root. Elijah taught Micah to observe, to plan, to wait for the perfect moment when the world's imbalance could be turned to their advantage. Micah reminded Elijah that courage without action was nothing, that the fire in one's chest had to be fed, or it would die. Together, they learned that survival was not just about strength, but about strategy, patience, and unshakable trust. Even as the master's voices carried across the fields, cutting through the morning air like knives, the brothers held on to each other and their vision. They shared silent signals in the rows of tobacco, subtle glances that communicated more than words ever could. They laughed quietly at the absurdity of the master's arrogance, imagining a world where those who thought themselves rulers would one day learn the cost of underestimating them. Every day, every act of obedience, every hidden glance, every whispered plan became another brick in the foundation of something larger than themselves, a dream of justice, freedom, and revenge. And in those moments, as the sun climbed higher and the overseer's shadows stretched long across the fields, the brothers felt it in their bones. The world was not yet theirs, but it could be. Their bond, their intelligence, and their courage were the sparks, and one day those sparks would ignite a fire the plantation would never forget. Night fell over the plantation like a heavy blanket, the sky a dark canvas dotted with faint stars that seemed to watch silently. The fields were quiet now, the day's labor complete, yet the air hummed with an energy that could not be seen, only felt. In hidden corners, behind thick groves of oak and willow, groups of enslaved men and women gathered in hushed voices, their words carrying through the shadows, tales of courage that had survived despite chains, whips, and fire. The brothers listened from a distance, hearts pounding, as stories unfolded like secret maps to freedom. One man spoke of a revolt that had scorched a distant plantation, the flames consuming more than timber, igniting hope in the hearts of those who heard of it. Another whispered of the Maroons in the swamps, people who had vanished from the eyes of masters and built lives that belonged entirely to themselves. Every tale was a spark, every whispered legend a flicker of light against the darkness of their own lives. Elijah's eyes narrowed, taking in every word, calculating, imagining the logistics, the timing, the risks. Micah's fists clenched at his sides, pulse racing, feeling the raw heat of anger and possibility coursing through him. They shared a look, silent and electric, the kind of glance that carried more meaning than speech. They did not need the details to understand the message. Freedom was not just a dream. It was a plan waiting to be realized. The elders told of ancestors who had resisted quietly, small acts of defiance that left no evidence but burned in memory. Tools disappeared for days, gates unlatched, crops sabotaged. These were not merely acts of survival, they were messages, warnings, a language of resistance passed from one generation to the next. Every story carried a lesson, every recollection a warning, and for the brothers, it was a revelation. Rebellion was not impossible. It was a choice, a rhythm that could be learned and mastered, a fire that could be fanned until it consumed the chains that bound them. As the night deepened, laughter and nervous murmurs mingled with the scent of damp earth and fireflies dancing in the shadows. The brothers moved closer, feeling the pulse of courage and fear intertwined, learning that resistance was as much about patience and cunning as it was about brute strength. They left the gathering with their minds racing, hearts pounding, a plan forming like smoke curling over the horizon. The whispers had planted something indelible within them, a dangerous seed of reckoning that would not be denied. By the time the moon disappeared behind a veil of clouds, the brothers were walking back to their quarters, silent but alight with thought. The plantation was still, yet nothing would ever be the same. They had heard the voices of rebellion, and now it had become their own. A fire had been lit in their hearts, one that would not be extinguished until justice, or vengeance, had finally been claimed. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the air thickened with the sharp scent of fear. The brothers moved through the fields alongside the other enslaved men and women, their backs bent, muscles straining, hands raw from the tools that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. The overseer's voice cut through the morning like a whip before the whip itself could strike, barking orders with a precision designed to remind them of their place. Every misstep was punished, every hesitation noted, and every glance away from labor considered defiance. Elijah and Micah exchanged subtle glances, their eyes carrying unspoken understanding. They had endured countless days of hardship, yet that morning would etch itself into memory. One of the younger boys had accidentally dropped a basket of cotton, and the overseer, eyes blazing with cruelty, seized him by the arm and flung him to the ground. The boy's scream tore through the quiet hum of labor, and before anyone could intervene, the lash cracked across his back, a sound that seemed to split the sky itself. The brothers froze, hearts pounding, fists clenching, as the punishment continued. The overseer struck not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each blow a brutal punctuation to the boy's terrified cries. Blood mixed with sweat and dirt, and for the first time, the brothers felt the full weight of their own helplessness pressing down like a physical force. Micah's stomach churned with nausea and rage. Elijah's mind raced, cataloging every detail, every opportunity, every weakness in the overseer's approach. The incident did not pass unnoticed by the others in the field. Some lowered their heads, whispering prayers to gods that felt distant, invisible. Some spat silently into the soil, a quiet, impotent defiance. But for the brothers, it sparked something far more dangerous. It was not fear alone that clenched their chests, it was a deep, burning anger, a realization that the chains were not merely physical, that the master's cruelty was designed to crush minds, break spirits, and erase hope. As the day wore on, the overseer's shadow lingered, a constant reminder of the violence that could strike at any moment. The brothers carried the boy's screams with them, replaying the scene in silence as they worked. Each swing of the hoe, each pull of the plow, was infused with an energy that was both restraint and planning, a simmering resolve that would not be quelled. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the fields in gold and crimson, Elijah and Micah had reached an unspoken decision. The lash had not just marked the boys' back, it had marked them as well. The anger it stirred could not be buried beneath sweat and soil. It would grow, gather strength, and one day, it would burn. The chains around their bodies would not contain the fire building in their hearts, a fire that was patient, calculating, and inevitable. The night was their only ally, a cloak of darkness that hid movement and muffled footsteps. The brothers had learned that survival depended on knowing not only the land, but the hearts of those around them. Elijah's eyes swept over the small clusters of enslaved people huddled near the edge of the forest, listening to whispered conversations that carried hints of fear, hope, and quiet defiance. Micah moved closer, crouching low behind a thick tree trunk, his ears straining to catch every word. Trust was a currency rarer than gold, and betrayal could mean death. Every glance, every gesture, every pause in speech had meaning. They began with observation, testing the waters with subtle actions that revealed loyalties. A shared nod at the right moment, a quietly offered bucket of water, the smallest act of mutual recognition. Some returned these gestures with warmth and eagerness, others with hesitation or suspicion. The brothers learned quickly who could be counted on and who would crumble under pressure. It was a delicate dance, a silent calculus of human behavior performed beneath the indifferent gaze of stars. Slowly, alliances began to form. An older man with hands calloused from decades of labor offered advice on moving unseen through the fields at night. A woman who had once been whipped for defiance whispered knowledge of hidden paths through the river cane, routes that could shield them if discovery came too close. Each person brought a skill, a piece of knowledge, a story that could shape the brothers' growing plan. Every meeting was brief, every word carefully measured. Yet each encounter left the brothers feeling more powerful, more prepared, more alive with purpose. The brothers also had to test themselves. Could they keep secrets? Could they mask their anger with obedience? Could they walk among the overseers, laugh at their jokes, nod at commands, all while nurturing a fire in their hearts that would one day consume those who thought themselves untouchable? Every glance exchanged, every hidden smile, every subtle hand signal strengthened the bond among those who dared to dream of freedom. In the quiet hours, beneath the watchful eyes of the moon and the whispering leaves, the brothers realized that this network was more than just a collection of allies. It was a lifeline, a pulse running beneath the surface of the plantation, unseen by the masters but alive with intent. Through these bonds, the first real possibility of rebellion began to take shape. The seeds of justice, planted in secrecy, were beginning to sprout. And as dawn approached, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah and Micah returned to the quarters with their minds racing. Each alliance, each secret shared, brought them closer to a future that would not be dictated by whips or fear. The fire in their hearts had found fuel in others, and they knew that when the time came, it would be a blaze no master could extinguish. The sun rose over the plantation, pale and unforgiving, casting long shadows that stretched like silent witnesses across the fields. Each morning carried the same rhythm of labor and fear, yet something in the air had begun to change. Whispers of unrest traveled through the rows of cotton and tobacco, soft and fleeting at first, but growing heavier with each passing day. The overseers noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the quick, almost imperceptible glances between the enslaved, and they responded with greater cruelty. The lash fell more often, strikes aimed not just to punish but to break spirits, to remind everyone that resistance would be met with swift, brutal force. Elijah and Micah felt the weight of this tension pressing against their chests as they worked. Every swing of the hoe, every pull of the plow, became a test of endurance, a battle between submission and the burning anger that coursed through their veins. They watched as neighbors crumbled under the lash, as tears mingled with sweat, as cries echoed across the fields and were swallowed by the indifferent sky. Each act of cruelty etched itself into memory, not as a warning to obey, but as fuel for the fire growing within them. The brothers had learned to move with caution, to mask their defiance beneath the guise of obedience, yet patience was not weakness. Every harsh word, every strike to the back of a fellow enslaved person strengthened their resolve. Micah's hands shook sometimes, not from labor but from the surge of suppressed rage, while Elijah's eyes narrowed, calculating, planning, storing each injustice as if it were a ledger to be balanced later. They began to notice the patterns, the predictable cruelty, the moments when masters and overseers became careless, when fear and anger could be turned into opportunity. Among the other enslaved people, a subtle solidarity was growing. Whispers shared in shadowed corners hinted at daring thoughts, at dreams of reprisal, at the possibility of turning their suffering into action. The air seemed charged with electricity, every stolen glance a spark, every hidden conversation a flicker of hope. The brothers realized that they were no longer alone in their anger. The network they had quietly nurtured was awakening, small but relentless, a pulse that threatened to disrupt the plantation's rigid order. By nightfall, the fields were empty and the plantation quiet, but the tension lingered like smoke that refused to disperse. The brothers met in secret, voices low and urgent, sharing what they had observed, what they had learned, and what they dared to dream. The world of chains and whips that surrounded them was harsh and unyielding, yet within the hearts of Elijah, Micah, and those who shared their vision, the first embers of rebellion glowed brighter than ever. It was a dangerous fire, patient and calculating, and it was ready to spread. The first sparks of defiance were quiet, almost imperceptible, but for the brothers, they marked the beginning of something dangerous and exhilarating. Early one morning, before the overseer's whistles shattered the calm, Elijah and Micah moved through the fields with careful precision. Their hands, calloused from relentless labor, now worked with a different purpose. A broken plow handle here, a sabotaged wheel there, small acts that would slow the day's work without drawing immediate suspicion. Each minor disruption carried the weight of rebellion, a signal that the enslaved would no longer bend without resistance. They were meticulous in their timing, too bold, and they would be discovered, too cautious, and the message would be lost. Elijah observed the guards' routines, memorizing when their attention drifted, when they became careless. Micah, fueled by fire and impatience, executed the actions with a precision tempered by his brother's calm guidance. Together, they became a silent force, unseen yet undeniable. Their presence felt in the delays, the frustrations, and the small failures of tools and labor that left overseers shouting in anger. Word traveled quickly among the enslaved. The subtle sabotage inspired quiet smiles and cautious admiration. Others began to test boundaries, performing minor acts of defiance. A bucket of water spilt, a rope untied, a gate left unlatched. The brothers watched from the edges, assessing loyalty, gauging courage, and learning who could be trusted when the stakes grew higher. Each act, though small, carried with it the electricity of possibility, the thrilling knowledge that the master's control was not absolute. At night, beneath the cover of darkness, the brothers huddled with their allies, voices low but charged with excitement. They recounted the day's successes, careful not to exaggerate, careful not to let fear creep into their words. Plans were whispered, strategies refined, maps of opportunity drawn in the dirt with sticks. The spark of defiance was spreading, fragile yet potent, connecting them in a web of shared intent that could not be ignored. The masters, meanwhile, sensed an undercurrent of unease but could not place it. Frustration mounted as work lagged, tools failed, and minor accidents seemed more frequent. The brothers smiled quietly when overseers cursed and demanded explanations. They were still invisible, their rebellion subtle, yet every act carried the weight of inevitability. In the shadows of the plantation, Elijah and Micah felt a growing confidence. The spark had become a small flame, fragile but persistent. The work of years in chains had not extinguished their will, it had honed it, sharpened it, and now it glowed with purpose. The world of oppression had cracks, and through those cracks, the fire of rebellion was beginning to shine. Every stolen moment, every silent act of sabotage, brought them closer to the day when the flames would no longer be contained. The nights grew darker, the air heavy with heat and smoke from distant hearths, and the brothers discovered a new kind of power hiding in plain sight. Fire, once a tool for cooking or warmth, revealed itself as something far more potent. Elijah had noticed the way it consumed wood, how a single spark could grow into an unstoppable blaze, how it demanded attention and respect. Micah felt its warmth differently, as a pulse, a heartbeat that resonated with the anger coiling inside him. Together, they began to understand that fire could be more than survival. It could be vengeance, warning, and liberation all at once. They began in secret, gathering scraps of wood and straw hidden beneath the shadows of the forest. With trembling hands, they struck flint against stone, creating sparks that leapt and danced before settling into small, controlled flames. Each attempt was a lesson in patience and discipline. Too much smoke, too little heat, too erratic a spark, and discovery would follow. But slowly, the brothers learned to coax fire into obedience, shaping it with their breath, their hands, their understanding of wind and fuel. Whispered instruction came from older enslaved men who had long understood the value of fire in both creation and destruction. They spoke in hushed tones about controlled burns in the fields, about the dangers of flames spreading beyond intention, about the way fire could be a language if wielded carefully. The brothers listened with awe, absorbing every word, every warning, every detail. They knew that this knowledge was forbidden, that the masters would consider it sacrilege, but the thrill only made the lessons more intoxicating. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, they practiced in secret corners, watching sparks catch on dry leaves, testing how quickly flames could spread and how easily they could be contained. They experimented with small torches, learning to carry fire without drawing attention, to light and extinguish it with near-magic precision. Fire became a teacher, a mirror of their own hidden anger and determination. Every crackle of a flame mirrored the thoughts in their minds, every flicker a reflection of the rebellion coiling in their hearts. By the end of each night, when the embers died and only smoke lingered, the brothers returned to the quarters with a new understanding. Fire was more than heat, it was power, a weapon that could rewrite the rules of the plantation. They could feel it simmering beneath their skin, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be a secret, when it would speak for them in ways their voices could not. The knowledge was dangerous, intoxicating, and irrevocable, and it had taken root in the hearts of Elijah and Micah. The fire was theirs now, silent, patient, and hungry, just as they were, waiting for the moment when it would rise and claim its place in the story of their rebellion. The air was thick with unease, heavier than the summer heat that pressed down on the plantation. Elijah and Micah felt it immediately, the shift in the quarters, the way glances lingered a beat too long, the hesitation in hands that once offered secret assistance. Trust, once a fragile but steady lifeline, now teetered on the edge of collapse. They had worked carefully to build a network, to connect allies who shared their dream of justice, but the shadow of betrayal had begun to creep in. It started with small signs, a hand that trembled too much when passing a message, a glance toward the overseer when none should have been there, a hushed conversation abruptly ended when the brothers approached. Elijah noted these details with a cold, meticulous patience, Micah with a sharper edge of anger and fear. One misstep, one slip of trust, and everything they had built could unravel in an instant. The thought of discovery, of lash and imprisonment, gnawed at their resolve, but it also sharpened it. Fear, they realized, could be as potent a motivator as hope. One evening, as the sun sank into the distant tree line, casting the quarters into shadows, a rumor reached them that chilled their bones. Someone among the enslaved was considering going to the masters, offering information in exchange for safety, for favor, for survival. The brothers exchanged a look heavy with understanding. Betrayal was the deadliest weapon of all, and now it walked among them, invisible yet deadly. They began careful observation, speaking in riddles, testing loyalty through small assignments, watching reactions, noting inconsistencies. Every word, every gesture, every hesitation was a signal. Micah's hands itched with frustration at the thought of traitors in their midst, but Elijah reminded him that patience would be their strongest defense. A misjudged confrontation could ignite disaster. They had to separate fear from loyalty, to distinguish the wavering from the true, to protect the fragile ember of rebellion before it was extinguished. Sleep became a scarce commodity, filled with dreams of suspicion and peril. Every creak of floorboards, every shout from the overseers, every rustle in the dark triggered heartbeats that drummed with tension. They spoke in whispers now, their plans and strategies compressed into coded language, hiding intention behind innocent words. The network remained, but it had grown fragile, a web straining under the weight of doubt and paranoia. Yet even in this climate of fear, a defiance persisted. The brothers knew betrayal was inevitable, that some hearts could not be trusted when pressed. Still, they held to the knowledge that courage could outshine treachery, that the fire they had nurtured could survive even in shadows. And as the night deepened over the quarters, Elijah and Micah resolved silently. No matter the threat, no matter the spies, their rebellion would continue. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had their determination. The ember of revolt would not die quietly. The nights had grown long, heavy with sweat, whispers, and the weight of impossible choices. Elijah and Micah moved through the quarters with quiet purpose, their minds consumed by a single, audacious vision. Every step they took, every glance exchanged, carried the knowledge that nothing could remain the same after what they were about to do. They had spent weeks gathering allies, testing loyalty, observing routines, and mapping every detail of the plantation. Now, the plan had crystallized, sharp and unyielding, a line drawn that would separate the life they had endured from the life they intended to claim. The moral struggle had been relentless. Both brothers wrestled with fear and conscience, knowing the act they contemplated was beyond anything the enslaved had dared before. Yet the lash, the cruelty, the daily degradation had carved anger and resolve into their hearts. They understood the cost, not only to themselves but to those who would follow them. There would be no retreat, no excuses, no halfway steps. The plantation, the masters, the system that had stolen their lives and the lives of countless others, would feel the full force of their rage. They met under the cover of darkness, by the edge of the forest, their allies forming a circle of quiet determination. Words were few, deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of the stakes. Elijah laid out the timing, the sequence of actions, the methods to ignite the flames that would consume the master's world. Micah reminded everyone of patience, of silence, of the lethal importance of secrecy. Each ally nodded, a mixture of fear, excitement, and grim resolve reflected in their eyes. They all understood that failure would mean death, but success, though terrifying, would be liberation, justice, and vengeance entwined. The brothers' minds raced as they revisited every detail: where the oil had been hidden, how the torches would be lit, how the fire would spread without giving them away too soon. Every contingency had to be accounted for, every possible betrayal imagined. Yet even in this meticulous planning, the fire of their intent burned brightest. They whispered about the masters who had lashed, humiliated, and stolen from them, the ones who believed themselves untouchable. Soon, that illusion would be shattered. As the first gray fingers of dawn brushed the horizon, Elijah and Micah returned to the quarters with hearts pounding, adrenaline coiling beneath their skin. They moved among their fellow enslaved people with careful casualness, hiding the storm within. Each face they passed, each quiet smile exchanged, reinforced their certainty. The plot was set, the spark ready to ignite. The fire was theirs, and the moment of reckoning was approaching. From the shadows of oppression, the brothers had forged a plan that would change everything, and there would be no turning back. The night pressed down on the plantation, with a weight heavier than any overseer's hand. Shadows stretched long across the quarters, twisting and swaying in the flicker of dim lanterns. Elijah and Micah moved like phantoms, gliding silently through familiar paths now transformed by anticipation and danger. Every step was measured, every sound accounted for, every glance shared a coded signal. The air tasted of tension, thick with the knowledge that by morning, nothing would be the same. They paused at the edge of the fields, where the tall stalks of tobacco and corn swayed under the faint breath of the wind. Here, hidden from prying eyes, they exchanged messages with their allies, hands brushing briefly in silent acknowledgement. Words were few and deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of final instructions, last-minute cautions, and the unspoken bond of shared risk. In these moments, the brothers felt the pulse of the rebellion, a living rhythm that thrummed in the darkness, urging them forward while warning them of the danger ahead. As the moon climbed higher, casting pale silver light across the land, Elijah and Micah found a moment to speak alone. They leaned close, voices barely above a whisper, and shared thoughts they could not say aloud to anyone else. Elijah's words trembled with resolve, a mixture of fear and certainty. Micah's eyes burned with anger and grief. The weight of every lash, every humiliation, every stolen day reflected in their depth. They exchanged what could have been farewells, though neither dared to name them as such. Dawn would bring action, and with it, the possibility that one or both might not return. Around them, the other enslaved gathered in small pockets of secrecy. Silent shadows in the night. Faces drawn tight with anxiety and courage. There were no songs, no laughter, no light-hearted chatter, only the quiet hum of shared purpose, the measured breathing of those preparing to defy a world built to crush them. The brothers moved among them, offering nods, brief touches, the reassurance that they were not alone in what lay ahead. When they returned to their quarters for a few stolen hours of rest, sleep proved elusive. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the whistle of the wind, the distant bark of a dog kept their hearts racing. They imagined the morning, the fire, the chaos, the faces of the masters who had terrorized their lives. And yet beneath the fear was a sense of inevitability, a certainty that the long-suppressed anger and courage could no longer be contained. The night wore on, slow and oppressive, yet alive with electricity. As the first pale hints of dawn edged the horizon, Elijah and Micah rose once more, hearts steady, minds sharp, and eyes fixed on the moment when shadows would give way to flames. Tomorrow would change everything, and they would face it together, bound by blood, by purpose, and by fire. The night was thick, almost suffocating, but it carried with it a strange electricity, a promise that the world could finally be rewritten. Elijah and Micah moved like shadows through the silent plantation, their bodies pressed low against the earth, hearts pounding in rhythm with the anticipation coursing through their veins. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured, every flicker of light ahead, a potential threat or a signal of freedom. Tonight, the fire they had nurtured in secret would leap from ember to inferno, and nothing could stop it. They reached the first of the masters' homes, the grand timber structure looming above them in the moonlight. Its walls had sheltered cruelty, its halls echoed with commands and lashings, and now it would be transformed into something far more terrifying. The brothers worked quickly, quietly, each movement a precise choreography honed over weeks of preparation. Torches were lit, soaked in oil and bound with care, the flames tiny but eager, waiting for the moment to roar. Elijah struck the first spark to the dry timber, a small hiss and whisper of flame that seemed almost polite in the stillness. Micah's hand hovered over the second torch, ready to ignite the next corner, ready to turn whisper into roar. Then it began. The fire caught greedily, licking at the wood, climbing with an insatiable hunger, sending up tongues of orange and gold that swallowed the walls like a beast. Smoke spiraled into the night sky, dark and suffocating, carrying with it the scent of vengeance and liberation. Shouts pierced the air almost immediately. The masters and their families stumbled into the night, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. Dogs barked, their cries lost in the roar of crackling timber, while enslaved people watched from the shadows, hearts hammering with exhilaration and terror. Chaos erupted, a storm of sound and movement as the carefully constructed lives of their oppressors dissolved into smoke and ash. Yet amidst the tumult, the brothers remained focused, guiding their allies with sharp commands, ensuring that the fire spread precisely, strategically, without harming those who had risked everything to stand beside them. The plantation burned with a terrible beauty. Flames danced across walls, ceilings collapsed, windows shattered under the heat, and the night became a canvas of fire and shadow. Every crackle was a drumbeat of justice, every plume of smoke a signal that the long years of suffering had reached a climax. Elijah and Micah felt it in their bones, the mixture of fear, exhilaration, and righteous fury that had carried them to this moment. The world was changing, irrevocably, and they were the hands that had set it alight. By the time the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the fire had consumed what it was meant to consume. The masters' homes were nothing but smoldering ruin, a testament to the power of rebellion and the fury of the oppressed. For the brothers and their allies, there was no turning back. The flames had spoken, and the world would never be the same. The fire roared now, consuming everything in its path with a ferocity that mirrored the years of anger and suffering it had been born from. The masters, once untouchable in their arrogance, were trapped by walls that had promised safety but now became instruments of their demise. Elijah and Micah watched from the shadows, their breaths shallow, eyes wide with a mixture of awe, fear, and grim satisfaction. This was the moment that had been years in the making, the culmination of every lash endured, every humiliation suffered, every stolen hour of freedom. Flames leapt through windows, licking at the ceilings and spreading rapidly across the timber. The crackle and roar of the fire filled the night, a deafening chorus that drowned out every scream and command. Smoke curled thick and black, clawing at the sky, curling into the eyes and throats of those who had believed themselves untouchable. The masters pounded on doors, yanked at windows, their voices high and desperate, pleading with walls that would not answer. Every step they took brought them closer to the flames, closer to the end they had never imagined for themselves. The brothers moved with deliberate calm, heartbeats steady even as adrenaline surged through their veins. They observed every flicker, every reaction, every desperate attempt at escape. In their minds, the years of toil and terror played out in rapid succession, faces of beaten, bruised, and hungry enslaved men and women flashing like ghosts through memory. This was not mere revenge, this was justice, raw and unyielding, a reckoning long overdue. The air was thick with heat, burning and stifling, carrying the scent of wood, oil, and smoke. Elijah's hand rested briefly on Micah's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what they had accomplished and the horror that accompanied it. Around them, the other enslaved watched from hidden vantage points, some shaking with fear, some trembling with exhilaration. They had stood together, risking everything, and now they bore witness to the power of their defiance. The blaze consumed every corner, devouring floors, walls, and memories alike. Shadows danced across the land as the fire's glow reflected off terrified faces, revealing the vulnerability and mortality of those who had always sought to dominate. The brothers felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow, knowing that such acts of destruction were both necessary and horrifying. By the time the inferno began to wane, leaving only smoldering ruins and the acrid scent of ashes, the plantation was forever altered. The master's world had crumbled around them, and the brothers had seen the culmination of years of oppression, rage, and carefully nurtured defiance realized in flames. Nothing could undo what had been set in motion. The fire had spoken, and its message was irrevocable. The morning sun rose over the smoldering remains of the plantation, its light cruel and indifferent, illuminating the destruction with harsh clarity. Smoke still spiraled from the ruins, black and stubborn against the pale blue sky, carrying the scent of charred wood, scorched earth, and the lives that had been consumed by fire. Elijah and Micah stood at the edge of the devastation, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes scanning the ruins as reality slowly settled over them. 9 masters lay dead among the ashes, their arrogance and cruelty extinguished in a blaze that had been both precise and merciless. Silence enveloped the land, broken only by the occasional groan of a roof collapsing or the distant bark of a dog startled by the chaos. The brothers moved carefully through the remnants, their senses heightened, hearts heavy with the knowledge of what had been done. They had planned this moment for months, whispered over countless nights under the cover of darkness, yet seeing it fully realized carried a weight far beyond anticipation. Every charred beam, every collapsed wall, every blackened doorway bore witness to the fury they had harnessed, and it was as beautiful as it was horrifying. The physical toll was immediate. Elijah's hands ached from handling the torches, from guiding allies, from the sweat-soaked labor of carrying oil and wood. Micah's legs burned from hours of running between positions, ensuring the fire spread strategically, ensuring none of their own were harmed in the chaos. Yet it was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest. Faces of those they had seen beaten, starved, and broken flashed through their minds. The screams of the masters still echoed faintly, a stark reminder of the violence they had unleashed. Guilt and relief intertwined, a tangled knot they could not yet unravel. Around them, their allies emerged cautiously from the shadows. Some stared silently, too shocked to speak. Others whispered words of disbelief and exhilaration. The reality of the act, its permanence, began to sink in. These were not simple acts of defiance anymore. They were acts of irrevocable transformation, irreversible justice wrought through fire. The brothers understood that the plantation would never return to what it had been. The balance of power had shifted, and fear, raw and tangible, now ran through the veins of every surviving overseer and master's kin. Even as they surveyed the ruin, a heavy weight settled on Elijah and Micah. They had achieved what they had sought, yet the cost was immense. The fire had answered their rage, had served as their voice, yet it left questions lingering in the air, questions of morality, consequence, and the future that awaited them, and all who had dared to stand beside them. They had struck a blow for freedom, but the echoes of violence would linger far longer than the flames themselves. Nightfall offered a fragile cloak of protection as Elijah and Micah slipped away from the ruined plantation, their feet barely touching the earth as they moved through the tall grasses and tangled underbrush. The air was thick with smoke, carrying the bitter scent of charred wood and the acrid tang of destruction, but it also held the faint promise of freedom. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sounded like a trumpet of danger in the quiet darkness. The brothers' hearts pounded not just with fear, but with the pulse of exhilaration. They had struck back, ignited justice with their own hands, and yet the path ahead was fraught with peril. They paused at the edge of the property, surveying the familiar landscape transformed by fire. Shadows danced along the remnants of the burned-out buildings, casting twisted shapes that seemed to mock their flight. The master's cries had long since faded into the night, replaced by the low crackle of dying embers and the whispered prayers of those who had been forced to witness the inferno from hidden corners. Elijah tightened his grip on Micah's arm, a silent reminder that they were still bound by more than blood. They were bound by survival. The first signs of pursuit were subtle at first, a distant shout carried on the wind, the sound of hoofbeats faintly echoing in the valley, the occasional glint of lantern light between the trees. The brothers knew that their actions had left no room for mercy. The plantation would not forgive. The neighbors would not forget, and the surviving overseers would be relentless in their hunt. Every step they took was measured, deliberate, and yet urgent, for each passing moment increased the distance between them and the flames that had consumed their oppressors, and yet brought them closer to the hunters who would follow. They moved through familiar terrain, relying on knowledge gleaned from stolen moments and secret paths known only to those who labored in silence for years. Every creek they crossed, every thicket they wove through, became both a sanctuary and a potential trap. The night seemed alive, shadows stretching like fingers ready to snatch them. Yet it was also an ally, hiding them in its folds, allowing them to vanish from the world that had bound them for so long. Fatigue gnawed at their muscles, and hunger clawed at their stomachs. But fear was a sharper edge, cutting through exhaustion and keeping them alert. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, lungs burning with every sprint, every dodge, every leap over unseen roots and rocks. Micah glanced at Elijah, seeing mirrored in his eyes the same mixture of exhilaration and terror. They were free, yes, but the freedom was fragile, temporary, a thin veneer stretched over the looming threat of retribution. In the distance, they could hear the faint hum of a hunting party, voices carrying through the still night like a promise of vengeance. The brothers slowed, ducking low, slipping into the shadows of a dense copse of trees. Each heartbeat felt like a drum of war, each rustle a potential signal of danger. They whispered instructions to one another, silent codes honed over years of necessity, guiding them toward a path that might yet lead them out of sight, out of reach, and into the uncertain promise of tomorrow. As the hours crawled by, Elijah and Micah pressed on, driven by instinct, courage, and the unbreakable bond between them. Behind them, the world they had left burned, a vivid reminder of both justice and the storm of vengeance that would inevitably follow. Ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and peril, yet also the first glimmers of a life not dictated by chains. The night embraced them, both hunter and protector, as they vanished into the unknown, hearts pounding, shadows swallowing them whole, and the fire of rebellion still burning within. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of towering pines and tangled underbrush, each shadow a potential threat, each rustle a warning. Elijah and Micah moved swiftly, senses sharpened to an almost unbearable degree, their eyes scanning for both sanctuary and danger. Behind them, the distant shouts of pursuers cut through the night, a relentless reminder that the freedom they sought was not easily won. Local militias, enraged plantation owners, and hired trackers scoured the countryside, their lanterns bobbing through the dark like the eyes of predators. Every step the brothers took had to be calculated, every sound analyzed, for one misstep could cost them their lives. Water became both a refuge and a risk. They waded through shallow streams, letting the cold river lap at their legs, hoping to mask their scent and the sound of their passage. Fish scattered in the rippling current, sending flashes of silver into the moonlight, and the brothers pressed on silently, hearts hammering against their ribs. The night air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves, a pungent reminder of the land they had known all their lives, now transformed into both protector and trap. Allies moved alongside them, faces taut with tension, eyes darting in every direction. They had learned to read the forest as instinctively as their own shadows, slipping through thickets, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, and pausing only when the distant voices of their hunters faded into the darkness. Every footfall carried the weight of survival. Every breath was a prayer. Every glance a silent question. Would this night be the one that claimed them all? The hunters were cunning, tracking by scent, by footprint, by the faint disturbance left behind in the soil. They had the advantage of familiarity, of authority, of anger fueling their pursuit. Yet the brothers had learned to fight with more than strength. They fought with knowledge, with cunning, with a bond forged under the unrelenting lash of oppression. Every creek they crossed, every hill they scaled, became a strategic maneuver, a gamble played against those who believed the law and fire were on their side. At times, the shadows themselves seemed to conspire in their escape. Moonlight slanted through the treetops in jagged patterns, breaking up the outlines of their forms, concealing their passage from prying eyes. They moved silently, communicating with glances and subtle gestures, each brother anticipating the other's thoughts and fears. Fatigue gnawed at their muscles, hunger burned in their stomachs, yet the urgency of survival sharpened every sense, made every nerve a weapon. Hours turned into days, and the relentless pursuit tested them beyond physical endurance. Rivers became boundaries they could not easily cross, swamps became treacherous traps, and mountains loomed as silent sentinels. Each decision carried consequences. Each hesitation risked capture, and yet through it all, they pressed forward. Their allies, some limping, some silent with exhaustion, followed the brothers' lead, trusting in the strategy born of years of careful observation and whispered planning. The forest, vast and indifferent, swallowed them in its darkness, hiding them from the world that sought vengeance. And yet, even as they moved, the weight of inevitability pressed upon them. Every hunter closing in, every shouted order, every crackling twig reminded them that freedom was temporary, fragile, and always just beyond reach. Yet they pressed on, shadows among shadows, hearts burning with defiance, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, knowing that each step carried them further from chains, but closer to the uncertain trials that awaited beyond the trees. The forest was no longer just a refuge, it had become a crucible, testing the brothers' instincts, patience, and trust. Each step through the dense undergrowth carried the weight of uncertainty, yet nothing struck harder than the sting of betrayal. Elijah and Micah had learned to rely not just on themselves, but on a small band of allies who had proven their loyalty in whispered schemes and daring nights of preparation. Among them was Samuel, a wiry man with quick hands and a sharper mind, whose counsel had guided the brothers through the first days of flight. But now, under the blackened canopy of looming trees, his loyalty cracked. The first hint came in the form of hesitation. Samuel lingered at crossroads, offering excuses for delays, his eyes darting nervously toward the direction of pursuit. At first, Elijah wrote it off as fatigue, a momentary faltering in a man driven almost as hard as themselves. But whispers carried through the night, fragments of conversation caught between the trees, the faintest rustle of boots not matching the rhythm of their own. A gnawing suspicion rooted itself in Elijah's chest, cold and insistent, and he shared a look with Micah that said more than words ever could. It was during a narrow ravine, where the river cut a treacherous path through moss-covered rocks, that the betrayal revealed itself fully. As the group prepared to cross, Samuel lingered behind, supposedly scouting the other side. The brothers watched him disappear into the shadows. But instead of circling back, he met with a figure cloaked in the dark. A tracker, lantern swinging, a glimmer of greed in his eyes. The realization hit like a whip. Samuel had led the hunters to them. Micah's jaw tightened, muscles coiled, while Elijah's mind raced, calculating options, escapes, contingencies. Betrayal was dangerous, yes, But it was also predictable. Those who worked both sides left clues, hesitation, and patterns that could be exploited. They could not afford confrontation, not here, not now, with the hunters closing the distance and the river threatening to sweep away the unwary. Elijah whispered instructions to their remaining allies, voices low and precise, a choreography of survival born from desperation. They split, weaving through the trees in unpredictable arcs, luring the trackers away from the main body. Micah, eyes burning with a mixture of fury and sorrow, took a calculated risk, circling behind to observe Samuel's meeting. The sight of his former ally, exchanging information, speaking in hushed tones, confirmed everything. Trust had been shattered, and with it, the fragile sense of security they had clung to. Anger surged, but it was tempered by necessity. Every second spent dwelling on betrayal could cost lives. The brothers pushed forward, leading their group through hidden paths carved from memory and instinct. Rocks scraped their palms, branches whipped their faces, but every movement was purposeful. Every decision, weighed by the threat of pursuit and treachery. Behind them, the sound of distant voices, lanterns flickering like fireflies, reminded them that danger was immediate, relentless, and ever hungry. By dawn, the group had crossed into a safer stretch of woods, Samuel left behind as a silent figure swallowed by shadows and consequence. The betrayal left a scar deeper than any physical wound, a reminder that the fight for freedom demanded more than courage and cunning. It required the constant vigilance of mind and heart. Elijah and Micah paused on a ridge overlooking the forest, watching the sun crest the horizon, illuminating the land they now traversed with blood, fire, and the unspoken truth that betrayal was only the beginning of the trials to come. The forest could no longer shield them. After days of evasion, the hunters closed in with a methodical patience that only years of experience and obsession could perfect. Elijah and Micah, weary, bruised, and hungry, felt the walls of the world tightening around them. Their allies had scattered, slipping away into shadows or surrendering to necessity, leaving the brothers exposed. A trap had been laid along the river bend, and as the first faint cries of pursuit echoed off the mossy cliffs, Elijah understood. They were caught. The capture was swift, violent, and unceremonious. Hands grabbed them from behind, rough and unrelenting, yanking them to their knees in the muddy banks of the river. The men who held them were familiar faces: overseers, militiamen, and even one neighbor whose farm they had crossed weeks before. There was no room for negotiation, no chance to explain, only the cruel satisfaction of power wielded with impunity. Shackles bit into their wrists, the cold iron gnawing at flesh, and the brothers were dragged through the damp night air toward the looming plantation courthouse, a building whose very walls seemed to mock the audacity of their defiance. Inside, the trial awaited, a grotesque theater where justice and cruelty danced a macabre waltz. The brothers were thrust before the magistrate, their knees scraped, their bodies stiff from days of flight. The room was filled with neighbors, plantation owners, and militia, all eager witnesses to the punishment of those who dared defy the natural order they had imposed. The law, they would soon realize, was not blind. It was a weapon, wielded with precision to uphold the system of oppression that had fed them for generations. Voices rose in accusation, each word sharpened by anger and fear. The magistrate read the charges aloud, his tone devoid of compassion. Arson, murder, conspiracy, defiance. The evidence was stacked not in truth but in spectacle. Charred beams, burned tools, the terrified testimonies of surviving slaves coerced into compliance. Every detail painted the brothers as monsters rather than men, as symbols of disorder rather than as victims of a brutal system. Elijah and Micah stood side by side, their shoulders squared, eyes fixed on each other as a silent pact passed between them. There was no fear of death, for they had already stared it in the face under the fire-lit sky. There was only the indignation, the raw anger at the world that would bend the law to serve masters rather than justice. Every word spoken against them was met with measured silence. Every accusation, a reminder of the chains they had fought to escape. The trial became a performance, a demonstration of the power imbalance so fundamental to the plantation system. The brothers watched as their lives were dissected, their choices criminalized, and their very humanity questioned. They knew that the outcome was preordained, that fairness was a luxury reserved for those born into privilege. Yet even as the verdict loomed, even as the gavel threatened to seal their fate, Elijah and Micah drew strength from their bond, from the knowledge that the fire they had ignited had already left its mark on history. When the sentence came, it was swift, brutal, and absolute. Shackled and humiliated, the brothers were led away, each step echoing through the courthouse like a drumbeat of defiance. The trial had stripped them of freedom, yet it could not strip them of memory, of courage, of the knowledge that for a brief, burning moment they had seized justice with their own hands, challenging a system that had claimed the lives of countless others. Even behind cold iron bars and the weight of shackles, Elijah and Micah remained unbroken. The cells were damp, dark, and suffocating, the air thick with despair and the stench of men who had long forgotten the warmth of freedom. Yet within the confines of the prison, the brothers' spirits burned brighter than ever. Every whispered word from fellow captives, every guarded glance from sympathetic overseers, carried fragments of their story, and those fragments began to take on a life of their own. News of the brothers' defiance traveled like wildfire across the plantations of North Carolina. At night, when the masters slept, enslaved men and women gathered in hidden corners beneath the shadows of barns, by the banks of silent rivers, under the cover of swaying pines, and spoke in hushed tones of Elijah and Micah. They spoke of the fire that had consumed the plantation homes, of the courage it had taken to strike back at their oppressors, and of the brothers' unwavering bond in the face of imminent death. Each retelling added weight, detail, and purpose. What had been a singular act of vengeance became a symbol, a spark in the hearts of those who had long endured injustice in silence. The prison guards were unaware that their prisoners had become more than fugitives. They had become legends. Smuggled notes, small gestures of support, and secret messages carried by sympathetic slaves and even daring servants spread the tale, ensuring it would reach distant farms and isolated cabins. The story grew, not just as a cautionary tale of rebellion, but as proof that even the mightiest masters could be challenged, that courage could exist in the shadow of chains. The brothers' defiance resonated with a collective yearning for freedom, a silent oath that one day, the fire of resistance would be passed from hand to hand. Inside their cell, Elijah and Micah clung to this truth. When the nights were long and the cold pressed against their bones, they whispered to each other, recounting the faces of those who had followed them, the faces of those who had stood and resisted, if only for a fleeting moment. The memory of each small victory, the secret message delivered, the tool sabotaged, the plan meticulously executed became their armor against despair. Every ember of their defiance lived in the eyes of those who carried their story forward, in the courage that quietly blossomed on other plantations, and in the songs sung beneath the stars to honor their courage. Word of their resistance emboldened others, creating a network of courage and quiet rebellion. Farms that once trembled at the sound of the overseer's whip now held whispers of solidarity, of plans to resist, to survive, to fight in ways both subtle and profound. The brothers, though imprisoned, had achieved something no punishment could erase. They had ignited the imagination of a people long told they were powerless. Their actions had become a blueprint for courage, proof that resistance was possible even in the bleakest of circumstances. Elijah and Micah understood that their bodies might remain confined, but their spirits, their story, had already escaped. It moved through the forests, across fields, into the hearts of men and women who had once believed submission was their only option. Their legacy would not be measured in freedom regained or masters punished, but in the courage they ceded, in the defiance that spread like smoke on the wind, and in the unwavering knowledge that even in chains, the human spirit could not be extinguished. The fire had burned its course. The smoke that once clawed at the night sky had dissipated, leaving charred timbers and scorched earth where the masters' homes had stood. Yet the aftermath was far from quiet. The flames had consumed more than property. They had ignited a reckoning that would ripple through the generations, leaving fear, courage, and memory etched into every corner of the region. North Carolina's plantations bore witness to a new reality. one that even the most ruthless overseers could not ignore. The air was heavy with tension, a silent acknowledgement that the order they had maintained for decades had been challenged, and that the consequences were neither abstract nor fleeting. Elijah and Micah remained in the shadows of their imprisonment, shackles binding their bodies but never their resolve. The consequences of their actions had been immediate and severe: harsh interrogations, days of solitary confinement, and the constant watch of guards who viewed every movement as potential defiance. Yet even here, behind iron bars and under the ever-watchful eyes of those who sought to break them, their story lived on. Other enslaved men and women spoke of them in whispers, recounting the night the flames rose, the courage it took to act, and the unflinching unity of the brothers. These tales became the marrow of hope, a quiet rebellion that no whip, no jail, no law could extinguish. The repercussions spread beyond the plantation, seeping into neighboring lands. Masters doubled their vigilance, patrols multiplied, and distrust among the enslaved grew. Fear became a weapon wielded as deftly as any whip. Yet with fear came respect, begrudging and muted, and an unspoken acknowledgement that power was never absolute. Rumors of rebellion took root in the minds of those who had long accepted subjugation as unchangeable. The brothers' act became a beacon, a symbol that courage could confront cruelty, that defiance was not only possible but necessary for survival. Families spoke quietly around dim fires, teaching children that the world was cruel but that courage could shape it. Songs were sung, coded in rhythm and rhyme, carrying the story of Elijah and Micah across fields and forests. Their names became a mantra, a quiet incantation for resilience and defiance. Even in places where the master's presence was suffocating, the narrative traveled, reminding those who listened that freedom was a seed worth nurturing, and that justice, however delayed, could strike in unexpected ways. Yet the cost was undeniable. Lives were lost, homes destroyed, and the vengeance of the powerful descended on those who dared to emulate the brothers' courage. Generations would bear the scars of that night, etched in memory and in the shadows of plantations, in the cautious glances of the enslaved, and the relentless watchfulness of those who had survived the fire. The legacy of Elijah and Micah was not a simple tale of victory or escape. It was a complex tapestry of sacrifice, courage, and warning. It was proof that the human spirit could not be extinguished, even when confined by iron, fire, and fear. As the years passed, the flames themselves faded into history, but their aftermath lingered, a reminder that defiance carries both risk and power. The brothers had struck a blow at the heart of oppression, and in doing so, they had transformed not only their lives, but the consciousness of those who came after. Fear, courage, and the unbreakable desire for freedom intertwined, forming a legacy that could not be silenced, a story whispered from one generation to the next, a fire that would never die.